Okay, so before we start looking through the content this morning, there's just a couple of things that I wanted to mention. So the first one was I wanted to say thank you, again, kind of following up from last week for those of you that had posted some mid-module feedback for the module. Now, I've put a response to this in a couple of places. So one place I've put a response onto the Padlet that you were filling in. But I've also put it here on this module feedback bit, which is where I'll also post stuff in January once we've kind of finished the module as well. So just wanted to kind of let you know that it was there. I have read through it and I have tried to action some of the points that people raised. And again, thank you for raising those. So first thing, one of the points was about the lights. And I think finally 7 weeks into the program, I've managed to work out how to switch these lights off. So I'm not sure whether they'll come back on or not. But after 6 weeks, going into week 7, hopefully that's some progress in terms of the lights. Good morning. The other key point, and I think this was a good point in terms of the videos, for example, the recordings of the session. So there was a comment about can we ensure that the subtitles are on. So I've made sure to go back in and check the button that I'd forgotten to do before. So the subtitles are on there. And people were asking about the possibility of having a transcript of those recorded sessions as well. So to give you an example of what I've done, I'm just going to pick one of the weeks at random. So I'm going to pick week 5, for example. So you will see for all the weeks that we've had so far, other than week 1, and for some reason week 1 it wasn't picking up the audio properly, what I've gone back and done for weeks 2, 3, 4, 5 and 6, and I will continue doing from this week onwards, I've managed to kind of get an auto-generated transcript. Now, I thought this was a case of just clicking a button in Panopto and it would download. However, I've since found that's not the case. So I've downloaded the videos, converted them into YouTube videos, then got a transcript from YouTube and posted these up onto Canvas. And I'll show you what that looks like in a second, which isn't brilliant. Bless you. So what I've also tried to do as well is use AI, and in particular, I've asked Copilot to offer kind of a summary and a cleaned up version of the transcripts as well. So just to kind of give you an idea as to what those look like. Now, when we download the transcript, we look at something like anywhere between 40 and 79 pages of that, which is not the nicest thing to read through. And it kind of picks up every and and so on as well. So what I've tried to do in response to that, as I said, is use AI to try and tidy this up a little bit for us. So what you will see for each of the sessions before today, as I said, unfortunately, session 1, I couldn't get this to work for. Copilot's kind of gone through and offered a summary of what the key points were that we covered during the session. And then it's kind of taken that 44 pages of gumph and kind of put it into something that's a little bit more readable. Okay, so hopefully that is helpful going forward in terms of responding to those feedback points about transcripts and things on video. Okay, so as I said, I will make sure that from today onwards those are done, and I will release those as soon as they are available as well. Okay, so just wanted to kind of close the feedback loop to some extent, although I hate that phrase, but close the feedback loop in terms of showing that I have listened and I have actioned those please start doing points that people mentioned from last week. The other thing that I wanted to mention before we start as well is the assignment. Now, we've talked about the assignment quite a lot over the last 6 weeks or so. For better or worse, the assignment deadline is tomorrow. And just a quick reminder in terms of there's no cover sheet within the education modules, and what did you have to put on the assignment when you submit. So I've put this up as a reminder on the overview page for this week, week 7. But just as a quick recap, so we don't have those cover sheets anymore. So when you click on the assignment kind of function on the left-hand tab on the module, it takes you to this page, the assignment overview, and then it tells you what you need to put on each page of your assignment. So we need to put this kind of information in as a header, and then we'd also suggested that I thought it was university-wide, but within the faculty at least, the decision has been made that they want everyone within the faculty to kind of follow a common format in terms of naming their assignment. All right, so we've looked at this before a few weeks ago. So realistically, what you need to put on each page of your assignment. So if you insert this as a header, it'll automatically put it onto each page for you. So I would say realistically, you need the module code. So EDN 203, CW1, and then you do CW2 for the assignment in December. They want you to put your student number. They want you to put the word count. Okay, so word count from the first word of your introduction to the last word of your conclusion. And then there may be people in the room who have specific learning difference marking accommodations, for example. As tutors, because we don't see names and it's all marked blind, we don't know whether we should be applying those or not. So if you are in receipt of those marking accommodations, can you just please note something like SPLD yes in your header as well. On each page, have a page number as usual. They want you then to name your file along this type of format. So the name of the module, I'd say put in coursework 1 and then your student number. And then one of the things you were asked to do last year was to put in an AI statement. And there's a little bit of a grey area as to whether you need to put an AI statement or not. So I would say, just to cover yourself realistically, I would put in the sentence about using AI within your assignment. It doesn't come in as part of the word count. So what you have to put in, so this was what the assignment brief said you could use AI for. So in particular, you could use Copilot, for example, to help you draft the structure of your assignment or to help you find resources to support it. But for this particular assignment, you were kind of advised, don't get AI to write the text that you're going to submit for you. So your statement might be along the lines of, I haven't used AI tools at all, okay, which is fine. Equally, as we said, it was also fine within this assignment to use AI within the parameters of what's noted in the brief. So you may have something like, I've used Copilot to help me understand sources. And that's entirely fine as well. Now, there are one or two people who've already submitted. So a couple of people who were really eager to get this in before the deadline tomorrow. If you have submitted already, and you're looking at this and going, oh, flipping heck, I haven't put that on my assignment, don't panic, it'll be fine. All right. So for those of you who haven't submitted as yet, this is just kind of a reminder that this is the format to follow. All right. And as I said, I put that up on this week on Canvas as well. Excuse me, scrolling through the page. So when we scroll down here, we can see we've got the assignment reminder that we just went through there. All right. So any questions about the assignment for tomorrow, please let me know as we get towards the end of the session today. So following those bits, then what we're going to do then is move on with the kind of content for week 7. And what we'll see today as we go through, there's going to be a bit of a change in focus. So for the last 6 weeks, we've talked a lot about inclusion, largely because that is the focus of what you're submitting tomorrow. What we're going to move on with today is thinking a little bit about learners who might experience challenges to their inclusion, and what we're going to start to focus on a little bit more over the next 3 weeks is learners who would display some form of additional learning need. So in particular today, we're going to kind of narrow down to specific learning difficulties like dyslexia, for example. We're going to kind of finish that discussion off next week and start to think about autistic spectrum disorder. We're going to kind of link those specific terms back to a very broad term I'm sure you've come across before, neurodiversity, for example. And then we'll move on to look at other areas of need and other children who might experience barriers to their inclusion related to poverty, for example, related to communities they live in, related to ethnicity or gender or sexuality, or things like digital poverty or climate change and degradation, for example. So this is the slight change in focus as we go through today. So in particular, I just want to do a very quick recap of what we mentioned last week. And there was a couple of things we looked at. We looked at teaching assistants, ALNCOs, and then changes to legislation in Wales. I'm going to spend 2 minutes roughly thinking forward to what the next assignment is in December. Probably not the best time to think about that because the first one's coming in tomorrow, but I don't want to leave it too late in terms of signposting different things we've talked about and how they might fit in. And then, as I said, we're going to kind of work our way down through different areas of need and focus on dyslexia more specifically. So last week then, within the lecture and within the seminar, we talked about 2 different groups of practitioners whose role it is very much is to support inclusion, and in particular to support learners with ALN, but also support a wider range of learners across the school as well. So in the lecture on Thursday, we talked quite a bit about teaching assistants. We talked about the fact that teaching assistants were perhaps one of the most commonly used strategies in schools to support inclusion, and that role has changed over the last 60 years or so. So in the 1960s, we talked about welfare assistants, where very much the aim of that role was to be that kind of additional pair of hands in class to kind of help out with some of the menial tasks and to make sure children in the class were kind of okay. So if they were feeling sick, for example, it would be the teaching assistant who'd take them to the toilet and check that they were all right. And then as we've moved into the 21st century, we've moved away from welfare assistants to giving people roles like learning support assistant, teaching assistant, additional support assistant. So a range of different terminology which suggests perhaps the remit and role of that function has changed as well. And one of the things I think has come into practice is this role has become a lot more professional. So in the 1990s, we used to talk a lot in the literature about mum's army. In other words, those mums whose children were attending school who wanted some kind of part-time work or kind of school hours-based work, who would come in very often well-meaning but no qualification and would help out doing those kind of menial activities in class. And that kind of shows you very much the status people had in that role. Wasn't an awful lot of status. The pay wasn't great. It still isn't great, but it's better than it was. And arguably, there are still challenges around status and qualifications and training and things today as well. So we've moved to more being far more of a professional role. We said there was about 450,000 people across the UK employed in this role, doing a range of different things. And whilst my personal opinion is teaching assistants do an awful lot of good in terms of supporting learners within schools, some of the research was a little bit more damning. Not necessarily in terms of the people fulfilling the role, but the way in which people were asked to work. So things like having the least experience possibly, or the least qualified, or the person with the least status in the classroom. How many times can you remember being in school? I used to hear this a lot. I don't need to listen to you. You're only the teaching assistant. Okay, and those people potentially being asked to work with those learners who were the most vulnerable, the most challenged, the most difficult, whilst their teacher kind of sat and worked with those learners who were attaining better or were better behaved, for example. So we looked at those kind of roles. We also looked at the role of the ALNCO. Now, we said that since the early 1990s, it was an expectation that all schools across England and Wales had somebody in the role of SENCO, Special Education and Needs Coordinator. And I would say that the vast majority, if not all, of settings did. However, it wasn't a statutory role. In other words, it wasn't a legal requirement that that person was in place. So since the changes to the legislation in Wales, moving away from SENCO to ALNCO, the Additional Learning Needs Coordinator, it's now a statutory requirement that all schools in Wales and kind of preschool settings and FE colleges have someone in this role. This role is now, as I said, statutory, and it's probably wider than it used to be. And we talked about the fact that this looks different in different schools. Some ALNCOs might still teach, some might not, depending upon the size of the school, number of staff and the number of learners, for example. Last week then, we spent the last kind of half of the session thinking about we'd moved in Wales from a system of SEN to ALN. So we'd shared an SEN system with England for about 30 years, and then since 2018, and in particular since 2021, Wales has moved in its own direction, and we've now moved towards additional learning needs. And we've compared and contrasted the definitions before. We saw they were pretty much identical realistically in terms of the definition, but there are differences in practice. And we also looked at some of the challenges in Wales as well in relation to demographics. So a much smaller country than England, about 3.2 million people, about 75–80% of the population live across the M4 corridor, kind of between Llanelli and Newport, for example. About 60% plus of the country is rural. There's poor transport links, quite a working class country traditionally. A lot of those old industries that Wales was famous for, like coal mining or manufacturing, for example, have shut and are never coming back. And in some cases, we've had communities where people going into lifelong industries, they shut down in the mid-1980s and have never been replaced by anything else. And we've had potentially intergenerational poverty, or we're now on to the second or third generation of families who don't see a place for themselves in the workplace, for example. We also talked about Wales being quite challenged in terms of relative poverty. So about 22% of all people in Wales live in poverty, compared to about 30% of all children in Wales living in poverty. And we noted things like those learners who are entitled to free school meals, for example. About 40% of those learners achieve 5 A stars to C at GCSE, compared to 68% of learners who don't have that free school meal entitlement. So poverty has massive impacts. And we also talked about things like Wales as a bilingual country. However, probably 100% of the population speak English, compared to less than 20% who speak Welsh, and that can cause challenges in terms of access to Welsh medium services, including in education. And we also thought a little bit about the challenges, for example, in rural counties like Pembrokeshire or Ceredigion or Gwynedd, where we're starting to see kind of hollowed out rural and coastal communities, where vast amounts of holiday homes have been bought up, or Airbnb properties, meaning that some of these communities are now kind of seasonal, which has an impact in terms of the kind of full-time population. So local authorities in Wales get more money for more people living there. So if half the population doesn't live there full-time, and then local authorities get less money to spend on their population. Wales also has kind of a growing elderly population. So I think we've tipped over that limit where we've got more pensioners in Wales compared to children under the age of 18. So again, where do local authorities look to spend their money? So is it on social care for the elderly at the expense of schools, for example? And we also mentioned things like, what young families in some parts of Wales can no longer afford to live or rent in their communities and are moving away, meaning less children go to schools, which means schools have less money, which means they can employ less staff, which means they can bring in less support, and that has an impact as well. So all sorts of challenges within Wales. And then we said we'd moved from one system to another. Now, just going over those moves very, very briefly. When we change things, we tend to make a change either to make things better or a recognition that something wasn't working initially. And I think what the Welsh Government have tried to do genuinely well-meaningly is to kind of make changes for those two purposes. So one of the key challenges we had, and when we kind of look at it now, the question is, why did we ever have that? And I don't know. So at one point, when we had the old SEN system in Wales, for example, children attending school would go through the SEN system. However, if you left school, either because you had to or by choice to go to FE college, to do your BTECs or A-levels or level 3 qualifications, for example, your SEN support didn't follow over with you, and you went into a different system of support, which was the learning difficulties and disabilities. So the fact that you might have had that diagnosis of dyslexia in school and had that support in place in school, that didn't automatically carry over with you, and you had to go through that process again. And another key change, the old system used to support children between the ages of 4 and 18, so compulsory school age. It's now 0 to 25, for example, so that recognition that many learners will present with challenges before they start school. So if we can get kind of identification and support in place earlier, then that should have a positive impact. And also a recognition that many learners stay on in their education way past 18, 19 years of age. So a system that's hopefully cleaner than it used to be in terms of this one system follows you all the way through your education. And some of the other things we've got on the board here were aims of the goal, of this as well. So Welsh Government wanted education and practitioners to have high aspirations and expectations of all learners, which means that all learners should have improved outcomes. One of the key things that has gone really well, and we looked a few weeks ago at the medical model and the social model of need, the medical model of need ignoring people's voice and doing things to them. This legislation is very much underpinned by kind of social model principles, and talks about the fact that all children, young people and families should have a voice. And what we have in schools in Wales now is something called pupil-centred practice or person-centred practice, where we do things with and in agreement with, rather than doing things to. So those were kind of the aims of the changes. Now, schools in Wales have been looking at these changes since 2018. In particular, it came into operation in 2021. And one of the challenges that schools in Wales have faced is it's taken 4 years to move from one system of SEN over to the new system of ALN. So some learners over the last 4 years have been supported using the old system. Some learners have been supported using the new system. So schools have had to try and incorporate both of those systems at the same time, and also have the curriculum for Wales change in how they teach and what they teach, and also thinking about kind of the once in 100-year event in terms of the COVID pandemic, which has impacted on everything as well. So it's been a challenging process. We are now, since the 1st of September this year, fully under the ALN code and the new ALN system. And we mentioned last week that there had been 3 kind of big reviews of how things were going so far. And I'd put the links to those on the slides last week. So in 2023, things were kind of going okay, but schools in some cases were doing what they used to do, but they just called it something different. So some schools were a little bit slow in terms of updating and changing their practices. Back in 2024, then, the evidence seemed to suggest that schools had kind of stopped doing that. They were getting better at doing what they were doing. And interestingly, the key finding was schools were no longer spending as much time trying to think about the needs of some learners with ALN, rather that they were trying to improve the needs of all learners by focusing on inclusion. So I think that's a really positive point in many ways. And then we also noted then a review from Welsh Government earlier on this year where they talk about the need to think about how schools use data, for example, and in particular what we mean by additional learning provision, because we're not sure. Okay, so that's kind of where we got up to last week. I just want to spend 2 minutes kind of mentioning this. I'm not expecting you to take too much on board of this, but the second assignment we've said then comes in before Christmas. You've got 4 choices for this one. First choice is thinking about labels. Now, we've talked about labels before and whether they're positive or negative. Just to say that today we're going to be focused on a particular label, dyslexia. So you might decide, for example, to incorporate that into the assignment if you chose to do it. We've looked at that kind of behavioural, emotional, social label previously when we looked at Ben and Neil and their challenging behaviours, for example. We're going to be using the term neurodiversity as we go through the next few weeks, and we're going to be thinking about autism as well. So realistically, we have covered some of this already, but what we're going to focus on this week, next week, and the week after might be a key part if you decide to choose the first one. Second one, then, thinking about the changes to legislation, realistically, that's what we did last week. So if you are one of those people who are interested in policy and legislation and want to follow that choice through, what we did in week 6 would be where you'd find that information. This one is quite popular, I would say, previously. How does the environment impact upon children living with autistic spectrum disorder? We're going to start to focus on this at the end of next week, and very much it will be the focus of the week after as well. And then finally, inclusion. We've done inclusion to death to some extent over the last 6 weeks, but it is always going to be a thread that's in the background of what we're covering as well. Okay, so I just wanted to kind of note briefly in terms of signposting. We've got up to the end of coursework 1. This is coursework 2. Where would you kind of find the bits that you might look at? All right, so I'll pick that up again going forward, but I didn't want to leave it too long before mentioning that. Okay. So what we're going to do now then is move on to think a little bit more in terms of different areas of need. And I think I've shown you this diagram previously. Now, when we're thinking about learners with additional learning needs, there are kind of 4 big boxes or 4 categories that we can put learners in. So the first one, communication and interaction. We saw that graph a couple of weeks ago showing the number of learners identified and diagnosed with different areas of need in Wales. And we saw this kind of category as probably the most common. So here we might be thinking about learners with speech and language needs. So the most common area of need in kind of early years and primary school settings. Potentially learners who are on the autistic spectrum might also come into this category as well. So thinking about learners who are neurodiverse. Cognition and learning, which is what we're going to focus on today. So those learners who experience challenges in terms of how they process information. So much of this is to do with memory, storage, being able to access memory, and how that influences us in the classroom. So here we might be talking about terms like moderate learning difficulties. So that learner who maybe is kind of behind their peers right across the curriculum. And we might be talking about areas that are more specific, like dyslexia or dyscalculia, for example. Social, emotional and mental health difficulty. We've touched on this previously when we were looking at behaviour. So ADHD, for example, comes underneath this category, as does things like anxiety, eating disorders, substance misuse, for example. And probably the one that's the most simplistic to conceptualise, sensory and or physical needs. So those learners who have a hearing impairment, a visual impairment, multisensory impairment, or a physical challenge or illness, for example. And we'd said previously then that learners with ALN might fit quite nicely into one box, but equally might experience needs that go across 2, 3 or 4 of these. And sometimes we're thinking about learners who have a primary need. In other words, this is their main challenge. And we might also have secondary needs as well. And sometimes those secondary needs happen because their primary first level needs haven't been identified and supported. So that learner who goes into that cognition and learning category, they're dyslexic, they haven't been identified, they're finding it a struggle to keep up in class, have now developed school anxiety as a result of their challenges and experiences in school. Okay. So in terms of cognition and learning needs then, Now, learners have a cognition and learning need if they learn in a different way or in a different pace to learners of the same age. And we've seen that phrasing in the definition of SEN and ALN previously. Key thing potentially relates to organisation and memory skills. Now, there are all sorts of different specific learning difficulties and general learning difficulties, but these two features, these two traits, do seem to be a thread that goes through all of them to some extent. Now, when we're thinking about learners with a cognition and learning need, there are a number of different acronyms and categories we have. Now, we love an acronym in education, so we might be talking about learners who have a moderate learning difficulty. Now, what does that mean in practice? Now, it's a little bit vague, but potentially we're looking at somebody here who is learning at a lower pace or in a different way right across the curriculum compared to others of the same age. So that 14-year-old in secondary school who maybe their ability or learning stage is maybe the age of an 11-year-old. And that's right across the curriculum. Severe learning needs, or severe learning difficulties, I should say, sorry. So realistically, as the name suggests, a bit more severe. So that learner who maybe is 5, 6, 7 years behind where we might expect them to be. And then we also have profound and multiple learning difficulties. So that learner who is struggling across the curriculum, but might also be non-verbal, might also have personal care needs. So it might be incontinent, might be fed through a feeding tube, for example. So some of those learners we saw, like Felix, for example, in the Ysgol y Deri video, potentially focusing very much in that kind of category. A category that we used to have was GLD, General Learning Difficulties. Okay, again, slightly vague category, those learners that are just a bit behind their peers. And when we've looked at the numbers of learners in Wales with SEN and ALN, we've seen they've dropped by about 50,000 learners over the last 4 years. Potentially, some of that is because the GLD definition doesn't exist anymore. So those learners who would have been general learning difficulties, schools no longer count those learners. So that might be part of the reason for the drop in figures. So those top ones on there, realistically, that learner experiences challenges across every part of the curriculum. However, we do have some learners who have a specific learning difficulty. So this learner who might be excellent in maths, might be really good artistically, for example, but struggles with aspects of literacy. And when we're thinking about specific learning difficulties, there are 4 key ones, bless you, and we'll focus on dyslexia more specifically today, because that's the one that's most commonly identified. However, thinking back to those figures from a few weeks ago, only 2,305 children in schools in Wales have got a diagnosis of dyslexia. Now, I think that's a gross underrepresentation when we think about definitions, for example, which suggest about 10% of the UK population is probably dyslexic. So in reality, we might be looking at over 40,000 learners in Wales who are dyslexic, but only just over 2,000 who've been identified. So specific learning difficulties. So these difficulties aren't across the curriculum. So difficulty, lexia with literacy and language. Dyscalculia, difficulty, calculus to do with number. So we'll look at that a little bit more next week. Bless you. Dyspraxia, so praxis is in terms of bodily function, for example, things like coordination and balance and speech. So difficulty with those aspects. And one that is very rare to get a diagnosis in terms of this, dysgraphia, difficulty with physically handwriting. Okay, now, most of you have not seen my handwriting, which is great because my handwriting is appalling. I don't have dysgraphia, I'm just very messy when I'm handwriting. Okay, so it's a very difficult one to kind of identify. So, as I said, in particular today, then we're going to focus on dyslexia. Now, one of the challenges with people being identified, I'll go back to that slide for a second, is that there are all sorts of different traits and characteristics, and they go right across these areas. So a dyslexic learner, although their challenge is largely to do with literacy, we might find that they are quite good at supporting their literacy, and we find challenges when it comes to doing maths. So thinking about maths kind of questions you see in tests, so this is one that I'd found the other day, for example. This is a year 4 maths question, and it's written in the format of: a farmer has 26 cows that each produce 10 litres of milk every morning. How many litres of milk will the farmer have every day, and how many litres of milk will the farmer have every week? And there's an awful lot of literacy and words in that, basically, to get someone to do 26 times 10. Okay, so possibly that learner who is dyslexic might struggle with maths because of the language and literacy involved in the sum and how it's written. Equally, there are 2 different tasks in that: 26 times 10, and then that total times by 7 to get the overall answer. So there's multiple processes that are involved. That learner who is dyspraxic, for example, so we used to kind of call it clumsy child syndrome in the 1970s, that person who kind of lacked balance and seemed to fall over all the time, might experience challenges with speech and reading. So there is no clear cut, in some cases, difference between some of the traits and characteristics. And one of the things that's really hard in terms of diagnosis is that people can show all the traits of dyslexia and not be. And equally, there can be people who show none of the traits of dyslexia who are dyslexic. So it is quite a difficult one in some cases to identify. So one of the key challenges that everyone in this category potentially experiences is in relation to memory. Many of you in the room are doing the psychology modules as well. You may well have talked about memory in far more detail than I'm going to mention in terms of this. But realistically, we have a range of different types of memory. So we remember things by paying attention to our kind of sensory environment. We might be thinking about short-term memory. So you've heard something on the way in this morning and you've remembered that because you wanted to tell someone when you got in. We can think about working memory, remembering something long enough to be able to use it. So going back to that sum and the 2 different parts of it. And then we can think about long-term memory. So if we've got something that we've remembered in our short-term memory, if we repeat it often enough, it's likely that we will remember it in our long-term memory. However, if your memory is anything like mine, for example, as soon as you submit your assignment at 2 o'clock tomorrow, by 2:10, you'll have forgotten everything that you've written because you don't need to store it anymore. Okay, so memory is a challenge. So thinking about classrooms are busy places. How many of you had teachers, especially in secondary school, where as soon as you walked into a classroom, you had things like, good morning, come in, sit down, take your coat off, get your book out, look at the instruction on the board, open the textbook to page 6, copy down the title and the date, answer questions 1, 2, and 3, and then put your hands up when you finished. All right, so for some learners, I've remembered I had to come in and take my coat off. I haven't been able to process the rest of the information that I've been given. Working memory can be a challenge, as we said, in terms of things like doing math sums. You've read a page in a book and you've got to the end of it and I've got no idea what the hell it was I've read as I've gone through. You've driven in this morning and you've zoned out. You haven't crashed and ended up in a hedge, but you've got here, but you don't have any recognition of driving to get here. And then long-term memory can be a challenge in terms of things like exams, for example. So as we've said before, we don't have any exams in the education programme, partly in terms of kind of this debate. Do they measure your memory more than measuring what you know and what can do? So we're going to go on and take a look at dyslexia. Now, I tried having a go at doing something a little bit fancy the other day, and it's kind of not worked. So we're going to go old school in terms of doing this. So on Canvas, what I've put up for you on The core learning, no, it's not, it's on the next one. On the additional learning resources page for this week, I've put on here a link to a quiz. Okay, and what we've got on this quiz are 20 statements in relation to dyslexia. What I'd like you to do, if you're happy to do so, is open up that quiz, and I would like you to have a think for each of these questions. Is the answer true or false? Now, one of the things I think a problem with dyslexia, which we'll look at on a couple of slides' time, is that there's all sort of misunderstandings and myths and misfacts, I don't know if that's a word, about the aided if need itself. So if you're able to get onto Canvas and open up that quiz, I've got, I think, 7 or 8 paper copies. If anyone would prefer a paper copy instead, if you do, just put your hands up and I'll come round and see those people who put their hands up first. I'm going to give you 5 minutes or so to take a look, kind of quick snap judgment. Do you think these are true or false? And then what we'll do, we'll go through and see whether you were right or not, and whether in many cases the answer could be it depends. Okay, so anybody else want a paper copy of the quiz, just put your hand up. Okay. So I've got another 5 copies if anyone wants one. It's on week 7, so on the so on the additional learning resources page, so at the top just above the Padlet. All right. So feel free to kind of chat as you go through and do this. I'd like you to have a go in terms of kind of gut feeling about these rather than Googling anything. And then we look to see how right or not you are shortly. Ladies, do you mind filling that in and passing that back, please? Okay. All right, so there are 20 questions or 20 statements. All you need to think about is, are these true or false? All right, and then in some cases there's a definite answer. In some cases, maybe it's a little bit more complicated. So, another few minutes. As I said, I'm going to ask you to do this quite quickly. So, kind of initial gut feeling. Yeah, by all means, yeah. All right, if you go on to the next page, so it's the additional learning resources one, and then it's that one at the top there. All right. So, another 2 or 3 minutes or so, quick snap decision. Do you think these are true or false? All right. Possibly a really to Lewis. Yeah. Go on to paper one as well.
Yeah.
All right, you see? Yeah. All right? Yeah. Okay. Okay. Thank you. Give you another 2 minutes or so, and then we'll have a quick look through the answers, and then we'll see about having a short break before going on to the second half. You're right to the front. Ah, bueno time. Excellent. There we go. I've timed it right that time. Yeah, do it up. That's quite all right. Do you mind signing the register, ladies, and pass that up, please? Right, okay. So we've had roughly 5 minutes then to have a think about some of those statements. And what we're going to do then is just kind of go through and see what you think, really. And potentially the way I've worded some of these makes them a little bit more concrete than they are in actual fact. I've asked you to kind of make a binary choice between true or false, yes or no, but what we might see is maybe the answer is it depends, and it depends on every individual. Okay, so first one then, dyslexia is rare. Now I suppose in terms of this one, it depends on your definition of rare. But this does vary in different countries. So British Dyslexia Association in the UK, for example, suggests about 10% of the population is dyslexic. There are about 72 million people, I think, living in the UK. So 7.2 million people across the country being dyslexic, not necessarily rare. Different organisations in America suggested somewhere between 10 and 20% of the American population. When we look at other countries like France, it's about 7%. Italy, it's about 3%. China, potentially about 3%. Okay, so is it rare or not? I suppose it depends on your definition of rare. But UK, rule of thumb, about 10% of the population. Dyslexia is more common in boys, and the answer to this one is no. However, it's 4 times more likely to be diagnosed in boys than girls. So the rate of prevalence is probably 50-50 between boys and girls, but boys are far more likely to be diagnosed. 4 times as many boys have been identified with dyslexia than girls. And there's all sorts of reasons why that might be the case. So, for example, do boys and girls present differences differently? Arguably, in primary school, boys who are experiencing struggles in their learning are far more outwardly challenging in their behaviours than girls are. So maybe can girls kind of fly under the radar, for example? And this potentially is also the case in terms of autistic spectrum disorder we'll look at next week and week after as well. Is dyslexia a barrier to success? So realistically, it shouldn't be. For some learners, it will be, because of how they are taught and supported or not. So of itself, there is no reason why it should be a barrier. However, we will hear quite a few phrases today and next week along the lines of dyslexic people live in a non-dyslexic world. everything is set up to meet the needs of the majority of people who are not dyslexic, and because they have to try and fit in, maybe that can be a barrier. Dyslexia is linked to intelligence? No. So there's no link between dyslexia and intelligence at all. So dyslexia can occur right across that kind of spectrum of intelligence. Dyslexia can be cured? No. So it's not an illness. It's not something that we can cure. However, we can be supportive in terms of providing strategies that can be beneficial. Dyslexia is hereditary. In other words, it runs in families, and this one would appear to be true. Now, as we'll see shortly this morning, there is no agreement as to what causes dyslexia. However, it does seem to run in families. So if you have a dyslexic parent, you are more likely to be dyslexic yourself. However, that's not necessarily the case. You can have two severely dyslexic parents whose child is not dyslexic, and vice versa. But it is likely to be within families somewhere. Dyslexia is just poor reading and spelling. Now, we've said dyslexia is to do with language and literacy. Language and literacy have got more than reading and spelling. However, not all dyslexic learners do struggle with reading and spelling, so that one would be false. And there's all sorts of other challenges dyslexic learners might experience. Dyslexic learners quickly master automatic skills. Probably I should have explained this one earlier on. So those things that you do without having to consciously think about them. So tying shoelaces, using a knife and fork, riding a bike. Those of you that have had a drink this morning, you haven't consciously have to hold your hand to grab hold of that container and lift it up to your mouth, for example. There is a lot of evidence which shows that learners who are dyslexic struggle in terms of mastering these skills. So one of the last learners of school age that I did a dyslexia assessment with, for example, she was 11 years of age. It was about this time of year, and she was really excited because for the first time going through primary school, she'd been able to go and sit and eat lunch with her friends in school because she had finally mastered how to use a knife and fork. And up until that point, she was too embarrassed as to how she ate, and she sat and ate sandwiches because it was easier. Okay, so there can be challenges. Dyslexia can be outgrown. So, depends, challenges with a word in there. So, no, if you are dyslexic as a child, you will be a dyslexic pensioner. However, we can overcome some of the challenges that you might experience. The learning environment can either help a dyslexic learner or make things worse. Yes, that's very much the case, and we'll look at that a bit more detail next week. A common area of support that dyslexic learners might be given is things like different coloured backing paper or different coloured overlays or different colour lenses, for example. So can a dyslexic learner read if they have those supports in place? And the answer, I suppose, depends on whether they could read or not beforehand. So if a dyslexic learner is unable to process reading just by putting that on blue paper, that isn't going to make somebody able to read. But it does help, it is supportive. Dyslexia exists in non-alphabetic languages. So not all languages use letters. Now, English does. We'll look shortly at some of the challenges in the English language. It does appear that dyslexia does exist in other languages, but maybe it's slightly different. Okay. Number 13, dyslexic learners are less likely to get tired in class as they are not working as hard. And this is something I used to see teachers moaning about a lot when I was in school. Or you're not trying hard enough. Why haven't you done the work? You're just sitting there being lazy. Dyslexic learners are actually using far more processing power to try and do the same tasks as their non-dyslexic peers. So that child who's fallen asleep at lunchtime might be because there's a new baby at home and they've been kept awake. It might be because they've been up playing Call of Duty until 4 in the morning. But equally, it could be because they have absolutely exhausted themselves trying to process the tasks they've been asked to do during the morning. Dyslexia did not exist before we had written language. Now, this is an interesting one potentially. My feeling is that people have always been dyslexic. However, before we started to write things down, we didn't know some people had challenges with that task. So we probably didn't necessarily know about dyslexia until we had written language. But I would say if we go back through human history, people have always been dyslexic. Thinking about when you were in school, and this might depend on your age, for example, do you remember being taught how to do joined-up cursive writing? Okay, so some people are nodding, some people not quite so much. Okay, so this is quite a contentious one in school. So countries like France, for example, don't teach cursive writing. It's still on the curriculum in Wales. In England, I think it's you could teach it rather than you have to teach it. So there is some debate as to whether teaching children to join up their writing, does that help or not? And one argument is, well, if you're joining up your writing, you have to physically join together the sounds that make up words, and you have gaps between each word. So that might be helpful. However, flipping that question, when was the last time you saw something written in cursive joined up writing? Have you ever opened a newspaper, looked at a slide, been on a website where it's joined up? So are we potentially doing people a disservice? So that one is very much a depends, I suppose. Dyslexia first identified in 1968. Okay, so this one is false. So our first ever definition of dyslexia came out in 1968, but we've known about it since roughly 1873. So we've known about it for 150 years, but we can't agree, as we'll see on the next slide, if it exists. And if it does exist, which I do believe it does, if it does exist, what causes it? Number 17, being dyslexic might have a negative impact on your self-esteem. And it might do. Equally, it might have a positive impact on your self-esteem. I think I mentioned previously one of my learners, Juliet, for example, who at the age of 56 was diagnosed with dyslexia. Was really happy that she'd had a diagnosis, but really cross because she'd spent 40 years believing that she was sick with what she was told in school. So potentially having that diagnosis might be a powerful positive. Maybe not knowing and not understanding why you are struggling compared to peers might be a negative. If you are dyslexic, you are more likely to have ADHD. Statistically, this one is true. Okay, you are more likely to have ADHD, you are more likely to be autistic. Equally, you don't necessarily follow through, so there might be an aspect of correlation rather than causation. A key problem for dyslexic learners is reading letters and words backwards. Okay, and the answer is maybe sometimes. However, when you were learning to read and write and spell, did you mix up B's and D's, for example? I think we all do at times. Now, at one point, I used to teach teaching assistants, and they used to do a specific dyslexia module, which meant they became experts in supporting learners with dyslexia. They got accreditation for this, and one of the students came in one day saying she'd had a bit of an argument with a teacher that she worked in his class. And they'd worked together for 10 years. And she said, for my assignment, I have to work with a dyslexic learner and try and put some support in place. And the teacher's response was, that's not going to happen in this school because every learner knows the difference between B and D, therefore we don't have any dyslexic learners. So that was his perception of it. He also said, which I thought was quite special as well, we don't have any autistic learners in this school because I've never seen anyone walk in that funny tippy-tappy way. Yeah, so that was somebody who'd been a teacher for 25 years at that point. All right, and the final one then, dyslexia is a disadvantage for life. Now, there's two parts to that question, I suppose. It'll be lifelong. If you are a dyslexic child, you'll be a dyslexic adult, you'll be a dyslexic pensioner. However, whether it's a disadvantage or not is subject to debate. And one of the things I think we're very guilty of when we think about labels is focusing on what people can't do rather than focusing on positive traits. And there are all sorts of positive traits linked to dyslexia and autism, which we'll focus next week on, which maybe we forget about a little bit. Okay, I'm going to pause in 5 minutes or so that we have a quick break. But just before we get to that point, I did say that maybe what we talk about today to some extent might be helpful if you pick the labelling choice for the assignment. And dyslexia is, believe it or not, quite a contentious issue. So we do have people like this spanner in the top left-hand corner, for example, who came out with phrases like dyslexia doesn't exist. It's a made-up term so that children who belong in middle-class families don't feel ashamed that they're sick. Okay, so there is kind of that type of approach to dyslexia. Equally, there are other people, and this professor in Durham, I can kind of see where he's going with this one, talking about the fact that the label itself is a problem, and maybe we're either giving too many people the label who are not dyslexic, or maybe we're missing out people because the label isn't wide enough who could be dyslexic. So it's a challenging area. We're going to stop briefly now for a break for 5 minutes or so, but what we're going to look at when we come back, starting off, is challenges with the English language. So there are more people who are diagnosed with dyslexia in English-speaking countries. So why is that the case? So is it because there is more expertise in recognising what it is in those countries, or does the language itself have an impact? So it's 11:01. If we look to start back, say, at 11:08, so give you 7 minutes or so, and then we'll pick this up. We're going to do a couple of little tasks about English, and then we'll move on to think about dyslexia and what it might be and possible causes. Okay. Okay. So before we stopped for a break, then we looked at some examples of facts and fictions around dyslexia. We talked about the fact that it's quite contentious and debated as to whether it exists or not, and if it does exist, what causes it, that we're going to look at shortly. We also said then that countries that have English as their language are the countries where more people are identified with dyslexia compared to others. So UK, USA, Canada, South Africa, growing numbers in New Zealand and Scotland, New Zealand and Australia, and also in Singapore. So why is that the case? And one of the reasons might be, is it something to do with the language itself? Now, English as a language is quite complicated. Those of you that kind of went to school in Wales and kind of learned Welsh at the same time as well, Welsh maybe looks far more complex than English is, but actually is a far more regular, phonetically regular language than English is. So in Wales, for example, children who go through Welsh medium education very often don't get kind of diagnosed with dyslexia until they go to English medium secondary school, partly because Welsh is an easier language to engage with, even though it might not look like it. Okay. So one of the challenges we've got in the English language is we've got 26 letters, and when we're thinking about letters, we can refer to these as graphemes. So grapheme means to write. So we've got 26 symbols that we use to write at least 44 different phonemes, which are sounds. So what we don't have in English, which we do have a bit more in Welsh, we don't have a one-to-one grapheme phoneme correspondence. So I think I'm right in saying, for example, in Italian, there are 27 letters in the Italian alphabet, and each time you write that letter, the sound is the same. What we've got in English is more sounds, more phonemes than letters, graphemes, to write those down. So just to give you an example, in English we have 5 vowels. They make 10 sounds between them, A, E, E, and so on. And you can spell the 5 vowel sounds in about 36 different ways. And one of the challenges we've got in particular with things like vowels is sometimes we learn when we're little to know what the phoneme A is spelt with the letter A. And sometimes it is, But equally, sometimes it isn't. And sometimes we see words that have got a particular sound in that we think, oh, I know how to spell that, I know the grapheme for that, but actually that isn't in there at all. And that's partly to do with the fact that maybe English is a kind of a made-up language that's a mixture of all different languages from different parts of the world to different extents. Okay, so I might have shown you this before, or you may have seen this before. This is quite a common query, for example. Is anyone able to say the words in red at the bottom of the page there? I think we could probably all read and. Okay, but what do those three words there say? Now, this is a bit of a trick question, but it kind of just shows some of the challenges inherent with the English language. Now, there is a way that that combination of letters spells fish and chips. Okay, now it doesn't look like it, but it kind of does when we think about those combinations of letters in other words. So, if we think about the word enough, for example, ends in GH. So we have words where GH make the phoneme. There's only kind of one word, and it depends on how you say it, I suppose, where O sounds like an I, and it's to do with women. Okay, so some people will say women, some people will say women, for example. TI making a sh sound like in nation or lotion. Okay, the chips bit is a little bit more complicated. So TCH like the end of match, the O again like women. Can anybody think of a word where GH spells P? And there is only one word in the English language that does this, and it depends on whether you spell it in an American version or British version. Okay, and the word itself is hiccup. Okay, now I remember being in school and remembering to spell hiccup, H-I-C-C-U-P. Right, in English, hiccup is H-I-C-O-U-G-H, hiccough, but we pronounce it hiccup. So there are challenges in the English language. We don't have a one-to-one grapheme-phoneme correspondence. Now, just to give you some silly examples, I'm going to ask you to do some spellings shortly. Now, I'm not going to come around and test these spellings. These are all words that we use. The first few words, I want you to write them down and highlight how we spell the A sound. And then the second thing I'm going to ask you to do, I'm going to give you some homophones. So homo, same, phone, sound. Words that sound the same but are spelt differently. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to ask you to do is spell 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 words that have all got the A sound in them. Okay, so it sounds straightforward. What I want you to do is to write down the word and highlight, so underline it, circle it, whatever way you want to do, the grapheme or graphemes that spell the A sound. So the first word is acorn. So you've gone for a walk and acorns have fallen off the tree. Okay, so nice one to start off with. The A sound in acorn is just spelled for the letter A. Second one, then, you were walking through the grass and you've come across a snake. Okay, so write down the word snake. How do we spell the A sound this time? Now, it's the same sound, but the spelling, the grapheme, is different. Okay, so in acorn, A is just spelled with the letter A. What makes the A sound in the word snake? Okay, now sometimes in primary schools we hear this referred to as the magic E, for example, or the technical phrase, it's a split bigraph, 2 letters to make one sound. So the A sound in snake is the A and then the E on the end. If you took the E off the end of snake, how would you pronounce that word? You'd probably say it as snack. Okay, so the A with the E in the end is how we spell the A in snake. The next one, just before we started this task, you had a break. Now I know there's 2 different ways of spelling break, but in terms of the have a break, have a Kit Kat type of break, how do we spell break? Okay, so it's the same sound, it's the same phoneme, different spelling again. So it's EA this time. Okay, The next word, I'm kind of getting closer to Christmas, so this is a hard one to spell. I never remember the order of these letters. Reindeer. Okay, how do we spell reindeer? And how do we spell the A sound in reindeer? Okay, so starting to get trickier now. We don't have the letter A in reindeer. So we learn in school the letter A, the grapheme spells A. Reindeer, the A sound is EI. So where's that come from? How does that happen? The next one, I can never kind of work out how to say this, right? So the number 8 written as a word. Okay, so you've treated yourself to an after 8 mint. All right, so how is the A sound in 8 spelt? So so far we've had an A with a magic E on the end. We've had an EA, we've had EI. This time it's EIGH. Okay, and then the final one I'm going to give you is prey, as in a bird of prey. No idea what that arm gesture was then. Right? So a bird of prey, how do we spell the A sound in that? So it's EY. So 6 different examples there of spelling the same phoneme, the same sound. You go through school, well, the letter A spells A. Well, it does sometimes, but not always. Okay, so we can see straight away in just kind of quite a silly example, it gets complicated quite quickly. Next thing I want you to do then, I'm going to give you some homophones. So homo, same, phone, sound, words that sound the same but are spelt differently. So first of all, what are the 2 ways of spelling flower? Okay, flower. So as in you pick the flower and the flour you make your bread from. Second one, 2 ways of spelling peace. Nice peace and quiet to enjoy a piece of cake. Okay, sounds exactly the same, spelt differently. Why are they different? Okay, the next few I'm going to give you, there are 3 different versions of spelling these words now. So the next one I want you to spell is, what are the 3 ways you can spell I'll? So I'll do something. I'm going to get married, I'm going to walk down the aisle, and we're going on honeymoon to a nice sunny isle. All right, so 3 different ways of spelling I'll. Okay, now some letters in common there, same sounds, look different. The next one, what are the 3 different ways of spelling right? So as in turn right, as in write your assignment, and in someone whose job is to be a wheelwright, for example. Okay, so same sounds, different ways of spelling. As in somebody whose job is like a shipwright or a wheelwright, or maybe someone whose surname is Cartwright, for example. All right, so same sounds, different ways of spelling, different meanings. Just a couple more to go. What are the 3 different ways of spelling you? So as in me and you, as in a yew tree, and I can't think of any other way of saying it other than you as in a lady sheep. Right. So different ways of spelling you. So me and you, there's a yew tree and there's a lady sheep standing underneath the yew tree. All right, and the final one, we've had a lot of this week. What are the 3 different ways of spelling rain? So rain as in falling out of the sky, and the other 2 that I can't think of an example. Right, so King Charles is reigning. So rain, rain, rain. All right. So just some very simple examples this morning, just to show that the English language is challenging. We don't always spell the same phoneme, the same sound, using the same graphemes. So it makes it far more complicated. You start in school, you learn to spell the sound A with the letter A, and then as words get more complicated, you find that isn't always the case. Okay, so One of the other challenges in English is that we've got a lot of words that we would say are part of the English language, but they come from all of the different parts of the world and different language systems as well. So I'm going to pinch the ones in purple on the right of the screen from Horrible Histories. So anger, awkward, gag, gift, husband, scare, Thursday. Now, we definitely use those in the English language, but these all come from kind of Viking, Nordic, Norse languages. Okay, the ones in, what's that, kind of a dark pinky colour? So chipmunk, Eskimo, husky, papoose, squash, chocolate, tomato, potato, anorak, igloo, hammock. All these come from kind of native languages in either North or South America. So kind of Inuit languages like igloo or South American languages like chocolate. The horrible colour next to it, we've got bog, hooligan, slogan, whiskey, corgi and dad. Now these come potentially from kind of Gaelic and Celtic languages. So bog, hooligan, slogan, whiskey either comes from Scots or Irish Gaelic, for example. The other two at the bottom are a little bit more tenuous, as is the word penguin, as to whether these come from Welsh. So we don't have very many Welsh words in the English language, but maybe corgi, cor, dwarf, he, dog. So that small dog, that breed, does that come from Welsh? Most languages use the word father. In Welsh we have tad. Does dad kind of come from that? The green language we've got from the Indian subcontinent, so thinking about kind of the British being out in India, for example, and we brought back words like bungalow, chutney, jungle, punch, pajamas, shampoo, yoga, for example. The words in red at the top, beef, blue, cinema, terrace, passport, jewelry, government, all come from French. And then these words in the blue come very often either from kind of Latin or ancient Greek. And I think these words are quite nice because you probably all heard about and would have learnt phonics when you were in school. You were taught how to split words up into chunks of sounds. An alternative approach we'll look at next week is to split words up into morphemes, different chunks of meaning. Okay, so for example, does anybody drive an automatic car? Okay, now if you've got an automatic car, what's the difference between that and a manual car? Okay, it changes gear itself. So auto, every time you see the word auto, it means self. So if you read someone's autobiography, you've read their auto, self, bio, life, ography, story. You've read their self-written life story. Anytime you see the combination of letters telly, like television, telly means from far away. So the telephone, sounds that come from far away. Television, pictures that come from far away. So as well as teaching how we can kind of split words up into sounds, we can also split them up into chunks of meaning. So every time, like dyslexia, dyscalculia, dyspraxia, DYS means not able. Okay, so another kind of way of teaching words. English is a complicated language because come from other countries, we borrow words. We've got a lot of words in the English language. There's about 500,000 words in common English usage at any one time. Might have seen on the news the other day, there was kind of a dictionary bringing in the new words of the year. So vibe coding, which I'd never heard of because I'm old, is the kind of new word of the year for 2025, for example. That didn't exist as a word 2 years ago. Okay, so we've got about 500,000 words in English at any one point. And those 500,000 words kind of come in and out of fashion and they can change their meaning. Okay, so a famous word that has changed its meaning since the kind of Brexit discussions, for example, is the word gammon. Okay, now gammon when I was little was kind of what you had on Boxing Day, so it's that kind of pork that you have. However, since kind of Brexit became an issue, gammon was used as a phrase to describe normally white middle-aged men who were of a Brexity persuasion who enjoyed moaning about foreigners coming into the country. as they were sitting there in Parliament with their bright red huffy faces. Right, so the meaning of words change. And if we compare English as a language, 500,000 words, French has got somewhere between 70 and 100,000. So we've got more words to have to learn to spell. We don't have enough letters, graphemes, to spell all our phoneme sounds, and words change over time. And I just thought I'd mention this briefly. There are all sorts of different ways in which words get invented. So I like the word onomatopoeia, it's a nice word to say, but realistically the word sounds like what it's trying to spell. So meow, pop, zip. Okay. Sometimes the meaning of the word extends, like a fly, so to be able to fly also becomes the name of the insect. So from the word study, we get the word student and studious and studio, for example. We get compound words. So the book you write your notes in becomes your notebook. The room at home that's got the bed in it becomes the bedroom. Thinking about morphology, and we look at this in the seminar next week, what we have a lot of in English is root words, and we stick prefixes at the front of them or suffixes at the end to make up something new. So lexia, language, we stick the word dis in front of it, dyslexia becomes a new word. Some words, their pronunciation changes over time, so fairly commonly known that breakfast comes from breaking your fast in the morning. That's the first meal you ate after not eating since the day before. Extraordinary, something that was greater than ordinary becomes extraordinary. Spellings change over time. So today we might say goodbye to each other. In the Middle Ages, that's kind of a shortening of may God be with you, for example. Eponyms, so all sorts of words come from people's names. So teddy bear, for example, name comes from President Theodore Roosevelt, who was quite squeamish about animal hunting. And there's a famous story about him and his friends going hunting, and he refuses to shoot the bear, and his friends gave him the nickname Teddy the Bear, for example, which is where the name teddy bear comes from. Okay, shrapnel. Sometimes we refer to that as having kind of lots of loose change in our pocket, but equally what's inside bullets to make sure they have their maximum effect when they hit you, named after General Shrapnel, who invented them. Okay, in my opinion, the devil's instrument, along with the recorder, the saxophone. Okay, phone, sound, named after a man called Adolf Sax. Adolf Sax's sound machine became the saxophone. Many of you are wearing denim jeans this morning. Okay, denim comes from Denim, which is the city in France where the blue dye comes from. So from Denim, we get the dye that makes your jeans blue. I like this one as an example, Hoover. How many of you have got a Hoover at home? Right, there's fancy, a couple of us have. How many of you have a Dyson Hoover at home? Right, none of us have, although I say this one, which annoys my wife a lot. Hoover is a particular brand name. Right, I've got a Dyson vacuum cleaner because I'm fancy. Right, I don't have a Dyson Hoover, but we talk about having the Hoover. I do the hoovering rather than the vacuum cleaning. Okay, the person who invented the vacuum cleaner was a man called Robert Spangler, which would be a far nicer name to have to go home and do some spangling at the end of the day, for example, rather than Hoover, who owned the company. And then this one, decibel. Okay, dec, kind of Latin for 10, bell, named after Alexander Graham Bell. So decibel, how loud sounds are. Words get shortened. So how many of you use your mobile telephone compared to your phone, for example? Acronyms. If you've been naughty down a wine street and the police have shot you with a taser, you've been shot by Thomas A. Swift's electric rifle, for example. I like that one. You've been to the cash point and you've got money from the automated teller machine. And we invent a lot of words by putting words together to make something new, which are called portmanteau words. So motels, for example, when we started to introduce hotels along the sides of the motorway in America, the motorway hotels became the motel. If any of you have ridden a moped, you've ridden a motorized pedal bike. Okay, women seem to be allowed to have friends, men have to have a bromance, okay, a brother romance. Brexit, British exit, mansplaining, I'm hopefully not doing that now. Glamping, glamorous camping, the internet, the international network. Emojis kind of came from emoticon, emotional icons. And any of you thinking about having Botox realistically, you're going to look at having botulinum toxin injected into your face and ended up looking like Simon Cowell, to avoid that. And then other words just get made up. Okay, so quite a complicated language. One of the things that dyslexia has had an issue with, I suppose, is a little bit like inclusion. There are all sorts of different definitions and we can't agree on what it is. Now, some of the definitions call it a difference. Some of it call it a difficulty. Some of it calls it a disability. Some of it calls it a disorder. All of those things are very different. If you have a disability, I think that sounds far more severe than having a difference. And potentially the focus is very much on can't do. So, challenge in dyslexia in terms of the label. And one of the issues is it too vague? So it's too vague, it's too open, and what it does, it includes people who shouldn't be in that definition, or is it too specific? In other words, there are many other people who could fall into that definition, but miss out because they don't quite fit. Now, I apologise, the text isn't the best colour on here, but this gives you an example, and I'm not expecting to read it all now, of different definitions that we have from different organisations. So for these four things here, they're all trying to define the same thing. Now, we said earlier on that dyslexia isn't an illness. It's not something that you go to the GP to get a diagnosis for. For example, you don't go to hospital for the dyslexia assessment. But the NHS talk about the fact it's a common learning difficulty, can cause problems with reading, writing and spelling. The challenge is something to do with remembering the sounds. It appears to run in families. Okay, so it seems to be genetic, and because of those genetics, your brain works differently. British Dyslexia Association builds on that, so it's likely to be available from birth. NHS says it's something to do with sounds. This one is far more in depth. It's something to do with phonological processing. In other words, your ability to manipulate and store and recognize sounds. It's something to do with rapid naming. If you are reading anything off the board at the moment, you are having to make a very split-second decision as to what that word is and what it sounds like. Dyslexia Action talks about the prevalence, and then this one on the right-hand side is the one that people who do dyslexia assessments in the UK, this is the one we most commonly use. So it comes from the Rhodes Report in 2009, and what this one says, which I think is quite nice at the bottom of it, it's quite difficult to say what dyslexia is. What we tend to do is, if we're thinking about somebody who's been to school, they've been taught appropriately, they've been taught in the same way as everyone else, and they still seem to be showing these traits and characteristics, then probably what we've got left is dyslexia. Okay, so just an example in terms of no single definition. Now, we're probably not going to get to the end of all these slides in the next few minutes, but we will get through these few and then we'll pick it up from next week. So we've known about dyslexia in 1873. We had the first definition in 1968. Some people still think it's a woke nonsense to avoid the embarrassment of some children, or to not shame schools for not teaching reading and writing and spelling properly. Other people have tried to kind of look at dyslexia and think about it in a more systematic way. And this diagram, I think, is quite a nice one in terms of trying to explain it. It comes from a duo called Morton Frith, who also spent some time trying to come up with a model that helps people to understand autism. And what they suggested was, in terms of dyslexia, it happens at a biological level. So it's something that we're born with. It's something to do with how our brains are wired up or process information. It's genetic. Because of that, it influences our cognitive level. In other words, how we process and remember information. And because we might process and remember information differently, we see common traits and behaviours. That learner in class who's really, really good at answering oral questions, but doesn't seem to be able to put their thoughts down onto paper, for example. Okay, so something that you're born with impacts upon how we think and process information and therefore learn, which means we see certain traits and characteristics. And for decades, really, people have been trying to think whether there is an environmental impact in terms of this as well. So people have kind of looked at, does it matter what year, what month of the year you're born in? And there are all sorts of studies that say in France, for example, you're more likely to be dyslexic if you're born in September. Research that was done in Scotland said you're more likely to be dyslexic if you're born in June or July. So there doesn't seem to be a correlation. But they were looking at things like if you were born in the summer, then mum would have been pregnant during the winter. Did that impact upon kind of nutrition and what she was eating and drinking, for example? Other people have looked at things like, does it matter whether you were born at 40 weeks or whether you were premature or whether you were post-term? And again, doesn't seem to matter. There does seem to be some research that shows you are more likely to display learning difficulties if you were born at 38 or 39 weeks rather than 40 weeks, but it's very tenuous. Other things people have looked at are things like environmental pollution. Now, there's a lot of studies that have been done in Germany, for example, that prove the negative impact for children living in and going to schools in heavily polluted areas. So it does seem to have a massive impact on learning outcomes, for example, but no definitive proof that airborne pollution causes dyslexia. Looking at that diagram in a little bit more detail, so on the biological level, something to do with genetics, which we'll pick up next week, which means our brains work differently. So quite a nice analogy maybe is thinking about people who are non-dyslexic, your brain runs on Apple software, whilst people who are dyslexic, your brain works on Android software. Not the best analogy, but kind of shows there is that difference. One isn't better than the other, it's just different. Because the dyslexic brain works differently, that impacts on speech and language, it impacts upon our ability to process sounds and pictures, it impacts upon our memory, and we see things like people who have challenges with reading, poor balance, challenges with spelling and writing, and maybe one environmental factor that is really important is the language itself. So maybe English, the reason why there are more dyslexic people in England compared to France is because of the challenges of the language itself. Okay, so I'm deliberately going to miss out a few slides, and I'm just going to kind of finish off on this point for this morning, and then we'll pick it up again next week. So one of the things that people have always thought was that the dyslexic brain worked differently to the non-dyslexic brain. However, that is incredibly difficult to prove. So going back to 1960, if a scientist is holding your brain in their hands, then something has gone seriously wrong. In the 1970s onwards, we started to see the invention of MRI scans. So rather than an X-ray, which kind of takes pictures of hard things like bones inside your body, MRI scans focusing on things like soft tissues. Okay, and initially, studies started to happen in Germany where they were looking at people who'd had motorcycle accidents, had a head injury, and had woken up and seemed to have lost some of the skills they had before that accident. So they'd lost speech, they'd lost the ability to read, which they had before the accident. So they started to kind of scan the brains of those patients. And then over time, those studies kind of developed in terms of scanning the brains of what they called typical readers. So in terms of terminology we're going to think about next week, neurotypical population, and then dyslexic or neurodivergent readers. Now what we've got here is a scan or series of scans showing the left hemisphere of the brain. So this is somebody who's kind of facing that way, and it's showing the left side of the brain. And if we look at the scan on the left-hand side of the page, the non-dyslexic reader, What these scans tended to show was 3 different areas were lighting up during the reading process. They were lighting up because oxygenated blood was being sent to those parts of the brain, suggesting that they were being used. So the non-dyslexic brain, when it's reading, seems to be using those 3 portions, of the brain. The dyslexic brain, then we can see there's quite a big difference. Potentially trying to do the same thing, trying to do the same job, but only one of those areas of the brain seem to light up. Now, that doesn't say that the dyslexic brain doesn't have those areas, but maybe the way in which the dyslexic brain is wired up means it's more difficult to access those. So again, this is another rubbish analogy. If we think about your brain being like a computer, each of these areas that light up is a particular folder of information. So the dyslexic brain doesn't seem to be able to access 2 of those folders of information that the non-dyslexic brain is using when it's reading. So what are those areas of the brain? Now, the one towards the front is called Broca's area. So again, from psychology, you might have come across this before. Realistically, this is the part of the brain that's involved in speech. So I'm talking to you at the moment. Broca's area is trying to make sure that I say the words that I want to say, and is making sure my mouth, my tongue, my lips, my teeth are in the right position to make the sounds I want to produce, and whether I got air coming in or out of my throat to make those sounds. So Broca's area is the part of the brain that sends the signal to your mouth to make sure the words or sounds you want to say come out. So when we're reading, realistically, we are doing something very similar to speaking. So what are these 2 areas at the back towards the brain then? So the yellow area is called the occipitotemporal area. And again, as a rather rubbish analogy, this is the folder in the brain where we store visual images. So whenever you see a word, that word, we kind of look at it in a sense as being a visual image. So when you are seeing words on a page, on a screen, your brain is trying to access that folder. Have I seen that word before? I've seen this image. Can I remember seeing it? The other part, and the parieto-temporal area, is focusing on, this is where we store memories about sounds. So, have I seen that image before? Can I remember what those words sound like, or what those letters sound like? And Broca's area is being sent those 2 clues to make the sounds that we want to say. The dyslexic brain then is trying to do the same job, potentially whilst struggling to access those 2 folders of information. So it's almost like the dyslexic brain is seeing the word for the first time every time you read it. Okay, now those are very rubbish analogies, but hopefully that kind of makes sense a little bit. Okay, I'm just going to finish off on this one bit, and then I'll stop talking at you. So we've said then, we've known about dyslexia for about 150 years. What we can't agree on is what causes it. And so far, our best guess is it's one of, or a combination of these 3 different theories. Okay, so it's a theory because we don't know. So we have the phonological deficit theory, and this does explain a lot of the challenges dyslexic learners might experience, which suggests the challenges in terms of processing sounds. You see these graphemes written on a page, and it's difficult to make the link back to the phoneme sound they represent. Or when you want to write something yourself, you've got the sound, can you remember back to its written form? However, some dyslexic learners talk about the fact, for example, that letters move around on the page or things are blurry. Now that isn't explained by the first one. So the magnocellular deficit theory talks about the fact that dyslexic learners might experience difficulties with how they process visual information. So another really rubbish analogy, most of us have one eye which is more dominant than the other. Okay? Otherwise, when we kind of looked around us, it would be constantly like looking at a 3D film without wearing the glasses. So our eyes are looking at things from slightly different angles. We see one image, however, maybe some people see kind of two. So maybe there's challenges there. They also suggest maybe some dyslexic learners can't hear some sounds. Okay, now if you decided to spend your time hanging around at shopping centres, for example, shopping centres in the UK and America are quite commonly fitted with something called mosquito alarms, which are also known as the teenage repellent. Okay, and it's an alarm that's on the wall which sends out an annoying sound which people who tend to be roughly the age of 11 to 24 can hear, and it's really irritating, like next door, and you tend to move away from it because it gets on your nerves. I'm 51, I don't hear that sound anymore. All right, so maybe it's something to do with how we process sounds, maybe it's something to do with how we process images, or the third one, the cerebellar deficit. So the cerebellar is the back of the brain where we kind of store memories about our physical movements in particular, sometimes known as the automatization deficit, which is a word that Google doesn't like, which suggests that maybe dyslexic learners, their main problem is memory. So probably it's some kind of combination of all of those things. So I'm going to stop talking at that point, you'll be pleased to know. We'll pick that up a little bit more next week. We'll also think a little bit next week about how we assess and diagnose learners with dyslexia. So if 10% of the population of Wales is dyslexic, why have we only got 2,300 dyslexic learners in school? And we'll also think a little bit about support strategies as well. And in particular, we'll think about kind of daft ways about supporting spelling. All right, so I'll stop there because I'm conscious another group is going to come in shortly. Thank you for coming in this morning. It's nice to see you. Any questions about today or anything else, please just get in touch. Hope all goes well with submitting your assignments when you submit them. And once they're submitted, have a lovely weekend when it comes.